Welcome to my presentation on multidimensional progression balancing and the case study set in Baldur's Gate 3. Today we'll talk a bit about what it means to understand game balance as a progression through a high-dimensional space instead of comparing single numbers between game elements and how to simulate, measure, and report about that. To make that number bashing way more concrete, I picked a game that hopefully everybody has heard of, with, besides magnificent narratives, a nicely complex combat system with many different skills, spells, abilities, items, build options, multi-classing, and so on and so forth. With so many different factors, how can a game still make sure that its elements are balanced? That, for example, all classes feel rewarding, that all of them are fit to overcome even the hardest challenges a game offers. This is not a multiplayer-only problem. Even in single-player games, while there might be some more and some less imbalanced options, you would take away a good part of the player experience if players are not able to make it with their desired character. Especially in a role-playing game that screams at you that you can be the hero in any way that you want. Therefore, the insights, terms, and tools of this work can ideally be used by game industrials to quick check their balance across a complex spectrum of the game and of player communities themselves to make arguments with evidence instead of anecdotic gut feeling recommendations. Because, let's be honest, players will come up with all kinds of tier lists and made-up scenarios, Excel sheet calculations, and a lot of claims to shout out which classes are good or bad in basically any game, at least in any game without an established benchmark. So what is a better benchmark? Some might remember about my Kai paper from last year, where I introduced a game-agnostic optimizer that does a full combat simulation in the backend and a manual or AI-assisted exploration of this on the front end. This was done on the combat logic and community of Guild Wars 2, and we showed that we can not only precisely simulate what is happening in combat, but also that players who use this tool had a significant increase in training effects when learning how to perform better in-game. Now, I modeled all classes, hundreds of skills, spells, and feats of Baldur's Gate 3 as well, so that A, interested players can click together their build and behavior of interest and see how it compares, and B, I can just make use out of the AI-driven search to get the optimal behavior with respect to damage and output numbers for all classes. This directly leads to the next point, in which I subjected all of the 12 available classes to a standardized benchmark. Now, if I say standardized, that already assumes a lot of things. Hold your thoughts for a minute, but these are the basic settings for the first benchmark environment. If you want the full details, I invite you to watch the in-depth 45-minute analysis video that explains everything. And if you compare every class to every other class in a combat of 10 rounds, you might find out that the Circle of the Moon Druid is the strongest class of all, and the Thief Rogue the weakest. But is it? And is this actually the proper way and proper constellation of how we should measure things? Well, only one way to find out. So I published the mentioned video on a couple of Baldur's Gate 3 channels as Reddit and YouTube, and reached out to the community about the following questions. I won't get into detail, but some assessed their own game knowledge and the benchmark, some were tool specific, and some tried to use the understanding of the community to come up with more factors important to balance, because those would make up the multidimensionality that this whole talk is about. In the end, I would say that at least a representative sample was reached, as from 500,000 viewers, over 1,000 used the tool on their own, and over 100 replied to at least one of the questions. Alright, what about the results? Read the paper if you want to know more, but almost 90% were positive that the benchmark was representative, and over 80% stated that they learned something new. Now back to the core topic. I did one benchmark of 12 classes in one idealized situation, which led to one number per class that should realistically describe how these classes are balanced throughout the whole progression of the game, the whole adventure. Hardly imaginable. So, what other factors are really important? For once, there is level progression. From early game over mid to end game, classes change. It's probably a good idea to look at every level or other important milestones and have this as an own dimension as well. There's combat progression. Some classes are better in short fights, other in long. It has to be considered. Then we have the set of available items and equipment, the many different encounters with weaknesses, resistances, different degrees of numbers of enemies per battle, the impact of the game's difficulty, the impact of how hard it is actually to play a class, since understanding and mastering all of the internal mechanics might be a spectrum as well, the dependency on support of other classes, the ability to give support to other classes, the progression of the whole game balance state across real-world time or balance patches, for example, and beyond combat utility. All in all, a lot to swallow. Alright then, let's get back to the drawing board. Instead of these fixed stats, let's assume that all of them are a dimension and open up a high dimensional space of benchmarks. That includes multiple bosses with their unique stats and abilities, more than just the endgame level, more than just the 10-round long-term scenario, and the performance under certain party constellations. Of course, there's still big factors missing, such as itemization and multi-classing, but for this context, I wanted to make clear statements about the state of balance for each unique class and not the items that are class independent or mixed multi-class factors. And these 5 dimensions already open up a space of 34,560 benchmarks that want to be compared. But how? One way would be to use 2D visualizations that people can still understand and flatten all of the other dimensions together. For example, look at this heat map of classes versus levels, with their relative damage potential plotted as bright blue when high or black when low. The Thief build that scored very low in our first benchmark is actually the strongest in the first 4 levels of the game, but then just loses its appeal. The Druid, on the other hand, needs half of the game until level 6 to really get momentum, while Ranger and Monk dominate the mid-game. As some players pointed out, this also marks very reliable cutoff points for multiclassing, so combining like 3 levels of Thief and at least 6 levels of Monk is a known and strong build option. And while you go through these slices, you can visualize any other dimensions of interest corresponding to the selected cell in accompanying plots, such as progression over combat rounds or across multiple encounters here. Besides visualizations, there are of course some kind of quantitative descriptors that can be derived from a higher dimensional set of game benchmarks that can ultimately give us some insights about game balance throughout multiple progressions of game-specific dimensions. But I won't get into detail here and now, as the only takeaway message for you today should be every game element should have its time and place to shine. If elements, like classes in this case, are worthwhile enough to have their niches in specific situations and specific bosses in specific level ranges, regions, constellations, etc., a game can still be considered balanced, diverse, and rewarding. I think Baldur's Gate 3 already did a fantastic job, even if outliers apply, of course, but take away some methods, tools, and the mindset that even if industrials and player communities do this a lot, comparing single numbers is not the end of the road. Future work? Well, there is plenty of things to do, even though I investigated the damage potential and balance between Baldur's Gate 3 classes to a fairly deep amount now. I still feel just like at the beginning of a colossal adventure. All of this work was mainly based on damage potential. While this is definitely not the end of the road, but it's more value than damage really. There's a whole world of benchmarks waiting when considering the whole range of equipment, multi-classing, new subclasses, mod support, and even then, it is only a single game, which I'll try to generalize from, as the underlying simulator has already been applied to other, systematically different games. Thanks for your attention so far. In case I've sparked your interest, I highly invite you to read my paper as linked in the video description.